to bring your lunch to this webinar and oh yeah, we are recording. So feel free to bring your lunch to this webinar and nibble away or drink your tea or your coffee while you're chatting with us. You'll see me with my overly massive tea mug as well. So it looks like our chat is disabled, but we have the Q&A open. So if you want to let us know where you're from, please feel free to use that to let us know your territory as well as where you're sitting right now. Thanks.
Hey, welcome everyone. And thank you for joining us for the first module in our social purpose real estate series, or for art spaces as well. My name is Alex Glass, and I'm the Executive Director of ArtsBuild Ontario. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm a white female with a white wall and a uh, uh, white dry eraser board behind me. ArtsBuild Ontario is a provincial arts service organization that provides small and medium-sized organizations with tools, training, and advice to successfully manage creative spaces. ABO works to reimagine the future of creative spaces through dedicated research projects and an engaged network of supportive partners. For over 20 years, ArtsBuild Ontario services have supported arts organizations, artists, and municipalities. ABO exists as an art service organization with a unique role on the provincial and national stage. There's no other organization in Ontario or Canada dedicated to supporting arts organizations of all disciplines with their cultural infrastructure needs. With a focus on small to mid-sized organizations, ArtsBuild Ontario supports all of those with a desire to build and manage spaces across the arts, creative sector, and cultural disciplines. We proudly work with nonprofit, grassroots, and for-profit entities, as well as Indigenous communities and groups and municipalities. We have a network that is wide-reaching from across Ontario and beyond. And in fact, over 25% of our network come from outside the province, with just over a third of our network based in major city centers. ABO takes great pride in supporting arts organizations from communities of all shapes and sizes. Our ABO acknowledges that our office is located in the 44 Gaukel Creative Workspace, which is a settler facility built on the traditional territory of the Attawandarok, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee peoples. 44 Gaukel is located in what is now Kitchener, Ontario, which is situated on the Haldimand Tract, land promised to Six Nations and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River from the source of its mouth. We're a settler organization and value respectful collaboration with all the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island who have lived on this land for thousands of years and who continue to be our neighbors, friends, and colleagues. Our work takes place in what is currently Ontario, which includes the traditional and unceded territories of the Anishinaabeg, Attawandarak, Petun, Cree, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Métis. Our mandate is to support arts facilities and creative spaces, but we do not solely define these from a colonial perspective. Arts facilities and creative spaces are not only physical buildings, they are often inclusive of the land itself. So social purpose real estate for art spaces is a 3-year project that will provide arts organizations with skills development through training modules, case studies, and a space lab program. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you. The project will provide a deepened understanding of and access to launching and managing social purpose real estate with a focus on small and medium cultural organizations. Social purpose real estate is driven by current challenges, needs, and innovative practices about social purpose real estate and began development in August 2024. The goals of social purpose real estate art spaces are to equip arts organizations with the knowledge and capacity needed to undertake multi-sector and shared space partnerships, develop a program that also addresses systemic inequities in land and space planning, create more sustainable and long-term art spaces, and strengthen the resilience of the sector. We're doing this through offering 8 online modules, the first being today's, 6 in-depth case studies, 4 panel discussions, and a space lab for social purpose real estate projects in partnership with Toronto Metropolitan University's Creative School. And lastly, we couldn't do this work without the incredible support of our partners and advisory committee members who are dedicated to seeing this project from start to finish and are detailed on our website. The leadership includes representatives from the Toronto Arts Council, the City of Toronto, Toronto Metropolitan University, the Infrastructure Institute, who's presenting here today, OCAD Youth Cultural Policy Hub, and of course, Creative Collisions with Kendra Fry. The logos are all pictured on the screen as well, all of those were mentioned before. And lastly, the project is made possible with support from the Department of Canadian Heritage. So we thank them for their generous support. I'd like to now introduce Kendra Fry. Our social purpose real estate consultant is a longtime partner of ArtsBuild Ontario. And she will be facilitating the remainder of the session and the question and answer period after the presentation. Kendra Fry, using she, her pronouns, is a cross-sectoral leader working to enhance the common good through the repurposing of faith in historic spaces, the building of affordable housing and placemaking initiatives to build neighborhoods. With Relevant, she works on churches across Canada, creating art centers, community hubs, food security sites, and housing focused on broad community transformation. With the City of Stratford, Kendra leads a consortium of individuals who are working to increase affordable and attainable housing stock and to transform approaches to housing policy and process. With her own company, Creative Collisions, Kendra utilizes her decades of experience in theater, music, opera, and dance to collaborate with arts and museum organizations undergoing transformative change and adapting current practices to an ever-changing landscape. Kendra, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Alex. I've got my script here, but I just want to take a moment to thank Alex and ArtsBuild Ontario for the incredible work getting us to this point. There were some ideas that some key collaborators had early on, most of whom are reflected in this slide that shows you the main collaborators. But it was really ArtsBuild Ontario's incredible focus on finding the funding for this and their dogged determination to make it happen that brings us here today. So I just want to thank Alex and Eva and everybody at ArtsBuild Ontario for that. So I'm really pleased to be here with all of you today. So I am Kendra Fry. I am a white woman. My pronouns are she, her. I am wearing an orange and white striped shirt, and my background is my living room that has a little stained glass and a window off to my right-hand side today. I really appreciate you all making the time to join us on your lunch hour. So, a few reminders about Zoom etiquette. So, feel free, take a break, do what you need to do. If you want to walk around, if you want to get tea, coffee, get your lunch, go ahead. It looks like we now have the chat enabled. And if I'm wrong about that, Eva can let me know because it looks like I've got some things going on here. There we go. Cool. We do have the chat enabled. So you can use the chat to share insights throughout the presentation. And while Maddie's presenting, I'll keep responding to commentaries and conversation within the chat. So please feel free to do that. So the Q&A function is in the bottom of your screen. We're going to use that in order to have questions banked towards the end for Maddie to respond to. And for any access support, use the chat to request support, and the ABO staff can help you with that. They're backing us up here. The webinar is also being recorded and will be posted on the ABO's website afterwards. The slides will be available in English and French. And lastly, I know you all know, but any disruptive or disrespectful behavior we are not going to have happening here. So we'll end up removing you from the webinar if there's anything of that variety. So moving on, I think it is time to introduce Maddie. There he is. Hey, Maddie. Okay, so we are thrilled to partner with the Infrastructure Institute to kick off this first module in the Social Purpose Real Estate for Arts Spaces series. So as we said, there's going to be 8 modules, and we gave the Infrastructure Institute the wonderful task of summarizing the whole thing in one mass go for us. So the Infrastructure Institute is a training, advisory, and interdisciplinary research hub at the University of Toronto's School of Cities. Their goal is to build local and global expertise in planning for civil and social infrastructure decision-making and delivery. Maddie is the director of the Infrastructure Institute at the School of Cities, University of Toronto, and a professor in the Department of Geography and Planning. His work focuses on delivering large-scale infrastructure projects, evidence-based investment decisions, and the effective integration of infrastructure into the fabric of cities. His recent studies explore transit policy, the value for money of 3P partnerships, the development of innovative mixed-use buildings as a form of place-based policy, and the diversity gap in the infrastructure industry workforce. Maddie consults widely on infrastructure policy and is a frequent media commentator on infrastructure and city planning, including this past week where he and I were at the Canadian Urban Institute together. Maddie, thanks again for joining us. We're going to pass over to you, and I'll just turn my camera off and move over to the chat.
Thank you, Kendra. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. It's great to share this space. I'm Maddie Simiatiki. I'm at my office at the University of Toronto on the St. George campus today. I'm a white man. I'm wearing a black sweater. I have a blurred background, but you can still see my light blue accent wall behind me. So it is really fantastic to be here to kick off this session and this series of webinars. This couldn't come at a more important time for our cities across Ontario and for the arts sector more broadly. Maybe I'll take a few minutes and just try to level set us and give us a bit of context for where I think we are in terms of the need for social purpose real estate and how the arts fit into this picture. I think it won't come as any great surprise. I think everyone is experiencing it. We're in the midst of an affordability crisis, and we're in the midst of a housing crisis. And this is shaping, the urgency of this crisis is shaping how everyone is coming to see real estate and coming to see how they use land and how they find space and have access to their communities. Everything is getting more expensive. And in the broader context, the real focus of late has been on housing and the housing crisis. And all orders of government, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, land trusts, everyone is laser focused at the moment on the housing crisis and how to address issues of affordability with housing. And there have been all sorts of programs that have been rolled out right across the country to try to incentivize and enable more housing to be built quicker and more affordably. This is laudable. This is critical for the success of our communities. At the same time, many of our other organizations are struggling with some of the same challenges that people are in the housing market. Rising costs, inflation, revenues that are not keeping up with those rising costs. In the arts in particular, challenges around returning post-pandemic and audience shifts in audience and how audiences are engaging with the arts. So at a time when everything is getting more expensive, there's more flux and more uncertainty in both the types of arts and how they're and the long-term financial sustainability, and also the types of spaces where those arts are being provided. And yet I don't think I need to say too much to this group, but the arts are critical to the success of our cities and to our communities. I mean, the arts, from the very local programs that allow youth and kids to express themselves and to learn how they work with others, all the way up to concerts like Taylor Swift, which I heard the stats just the other day generated $2 billion of ticket sales alone over the last 21 months as she toured around the world. So, I mean, the arts are clearly an economic engine, but I think with this group, I think we would all agree the arts are so much more than those who are, doing it for huge profits at the top of the, at the global scale, but also are about stitching our communities together and telling and telling our stories and keeping our stories and debating who we are as communities. So the spaces for the arts are critical, and where, and I'm talking about this because the where of where this happens and the types of spaces is so important. Because as I've mentioned, what's been happening recently is there's been some phenomenal wins where you're seeing new art spaces coming online and organizations using those to great effect. Some in my community, I'm based here in Toronto, some that come to mind. For example, Crow's Nest Theatre, which is in the East End, a relatively new theatre space, which is now putting on incredible avant-garde, cutting-edge, and community-engaged types of theatre that are telling our stories, including most recently the Master Plan play, which I saw a few weeks ago, which really tells, in many ways, tries to encapsulate some of the story of how Toronto is growing and the real estate pressures we're facing. So, there are these new and exciting art spaces that are coming online. There have also, thank you for correcting me, Crow's Theater. There have also been some real losses and some real uh, challenges. And the ones I don't think, again, with this group, it'll come as any great surprise. Artscape and the collapse of Artscape has been has really shone a spotlight on what happens when an organization grows very quickly and engages in the high stakes game of real estate alongside trying to bring the infuse the arts into it. So that was a very large collapse. And another one that really hit close to home for me is Sketch. Sketch was a local arts organization that did community bonds and other types of activities to raise resources in order to be able to afford their own space. And they raised money in the community, and they're really a local group serving community and serving diverse communities. And just recently, over in the summer, they ran into financial trouble and have now paused their activities. So the reason for telling both the wins and the losses is to say that real estate is critical. It is the place where these activities happen, but it's also high stakes and it is risky. And there are trade-offs associated with how one engages in real estate and what it can do both on the positive side for an organization in terms of giving it opportunity and creating a home, but also creating risk if the business plan and the revenues start to come under pressure. So this is the context in which I want to start talking about this idea of social purpose real estate and how it applies in the arts sector. Next slide, please. So the Infrastructure Institute. We've been around for around 3 years. A lot of our work has been how you build local infrastructure into the fabric of cities. And importantly, when you use the word infrastructure, often you think of the sewers and the pipes and the electricity lines and the transit and roads and civil infrastructure. But we argue and we practice by thinking that the community spaces are just as important. These are the social infrastructure that enables communities to thrive. And so we are laser focused on how you enable theaters and libraries and recreation centers and practice spaces, all of the types of, and concert halls, all of the types of spaces that enable arts and culture to thrive that is both good for the soul and good for the economy as well. Next slide. So our work, we have 3 streams and strands of work that we do. We do advisory and research work, which is a basic function of the university. So we work with a lot of different partners trying to engage and solve some of the thornier types of challenges related to infrastructure. In fact, one of the early projects we did was a project with Why Not Theater, trying to look at how in the midst of the pandemic, some of the spaces that had become open had become vacant, especially retail spaces along our main streets. How could those spaces be repurposed as meanwhile spaces for arts, and in particular for arts practice spaces and theater practice spaces in particular, which I found, this was initiated by Why Not Theater, so initiated by an arts organization, but thinking very creatively about how space can be adapted and reused and repurposed and rethought in ways that might not have been their initial goal or purpose. And as you'll see in my talk, that starts to, that idea of how things mix together will be a common theme that will run through the presentation. We do training, so we have our own social purpose real estate accelerator program that I think mirrors the ArtsBuild program. So I'm thrilled that we're collaborating on this and in this program with a specific focus on arts organizations. And then finally, we do engagements and my own personal dabbling into the arts. We've done a few exhibitions, which has been completely eye-opening, so rewarding. And it's, to me, again, it just speaks to how the arts connect with people, because we've been putting on shows about mixed-use buildings where we build models looking at, for example, how could a fire station be above a condominium or a condominium be above a fire station? And it's the kind of concept that seems so far out in one way. And when you actually visualize it, it connects with people in a very different way. And I think the same goes for arts and how theaters or concert and performing halls could be on the main floor with a lot of housing up above, and you start to solve multiple problems at the same time. And in fact, more than solve problems, you create synergies that make each partner stronger than if they tried to do it themselves. And next slide, please. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give a brief definition of social purpose real estate. I'll talk through some of the types of spaces, how different organizations are accessing those spaces. I want to give you an overview of the development process just so you can kind of make this a little bit more tangible. And we'll talk about ownership as well, ownership and governance, and then we'll circle back and we'll reflect on again some of the challenges and opportunities. But I think maybe the overarching theme of all of this is when we're talking about social purpose real estate in particular, this is a combination of market and non-market activities. And because of that, the organizations in one way or another are going to have revenue streams that enable them to cover the expenses of the development, both its capital, its planning costs, which has cost up front, its development costs during construction, and then its ongoing operation and maintenance. And this is, so whether that comes from grants, whether that comes from whether that comes from revenue that's generated, or whether it comes from fundraising and donations. Real estate is a long-term play. It's not something that happens over 1 year or 5 years or one executive director's term. It's something that happens over generations and decades. And so organizations need to have a solid business plan. And I don't like that term because I think it sounds a little wonky or a little corporate, but the organizations have to have a revenue plan in place that enables the real estate to be covered over its entire lifespan. And that will become a recurring theme as we talk through how organizations gain access to space. Maybe just one other point. I know when we think about social purpose real estate, everyone locks in on ownership. We talk about ownership in the housing market, and similarly in the commercial and social purpose market. I would just say, again, just like in the rental market, there's different ways that one can engage. And it's really critical that organizations are going to be looking inward at their own organizational capacity and organizational readiness to understand and evaluate which is the best model for them. If you have long-term revenue and you're you have a solid foundation and a large group that's or government funding that's paying into it, and then ownership is a really can be a really great strategy that gives you a long-term permanence. Other organizations that are maybe newer or face fluctuating revenues, ownership may be something that causes additional stress on an organization, and your core mandate could be providing arts, and you could run into trouble when that mixes with real estate, and the pressure that can build up very quickly when you're involved in sort of high stakes and high cost projects. So let's get into this in a little bit more detail now. Next slide, please. So definitionally, next slide. Social purpose real estate is a spectrum, and I think this is key to understand that there's not one definition or one type of project or approach, but what we're getting at here is organizations that are working at they're trying to do things that are outside of or adjacent to or in collaboration with the market. But the key with the social purpose real estate is that they're mission driven, not just profit driven, and they try to deliver social value beyond financial value. And that, again, that sounds a little bit wonkish, but what I'm getting at then is it can be everything from libraries and museums to affordable and deeply affordable housing, to parks, to nonprofit centers. All of these have a social mission and a social value that is beyond the bottom line. And the reason I say that this can blend with the private market is because often what we're seeing more and more of is projects being done in collaboration, where the market development might be involved in a certain component of the project, for example, building housing, and at its core on the ground floor, for example, could be arts and culture spaces. So you are seeing a broader range of partnerships, but the definition of social purpose real estate is really that it's mission driven and driven by the values rather than by profit. And again, the types of organizations, you'll recognize all of these because many of your organizations could be working either out of these spaces or in collaboration with the churches, the legions, the schools after hours, maybe even retail spaces as meanwhile on your main avenues and whatnot. Next slide, please. Okay, and what I want to highlight here too, because I'm seeing also in the chat just how broad and diverse the communities are that are attending. I think this is so exciting, and I'm so thrilled uh, that we have such a wide range. That ArtsBuild has connected with so many people in so many different sized communities, because the examples that I gave in many ways are very large examples, but that's not the only people doing social purpose real estate. I mean, social purpose real estate can be organizations providing arts out of a church basement recreation space, out of a legion, out of a school, out of a retail space, and those, so it scales to the types of to the community and to the types of programming that's being provided. And I think that's really an important part of this definition, so that everyone can feel included in it. Oftentimes, social purpose real estate, the Ontario Nonprofit Network is using this term social purpose real estate to refer to building in deep affordability and deeply affordable spaces into communities. Tides is a big foundation, a charity who funds some of this work. They also think about social purpose real estate. The United Way increasingly is using the term community real estate as the spaces where community happens. And I want to just pick up on the Tides definition for a moment, just to say a few points. One is around issues of equity, that we know that in the arts as well as in housing and other spaces that access has not been equal historically, and it's certainly not equal currently. And so part of the important role of social purpose real estate is to understand who's been excluded and to create pathways that racialized communities, Indigenous communities, LGBTQ communities are able to create their own spaces in their own that serve the types of arts and other types of housing and cultural spaces that they need to provide services that deliver on their goals. And so I think that's an important part of the definition of social purpose real estate as well. Next slide. Okay, so mission-driven versus profit-driven. I've covered a bit of this. I won't belabor it. Next slide. Really, at the core of mission-driven is that it serves communities and its core activities. And the key here is that it's not only driven by profit. I highlighted off the top that just because it's not driven by profit doesn't mean that it doesn't need a solid business plan or a solid revenue case or a solid way of ensuring that all of the costs that are associated with the project are paid. That is critical. That's instrumental, or the project doesn't float. The project won't go forward, or it'll run into trouble. And as we've seen with certain organizations recently, when these projects, even with the best of intentions and the best social purpose at its core, projects can run into trouble if there's not a business plan and revenue from all sorts of different sources enabling that project to proceed. But it differs from projects that are purely profit oriented, in the sense that the goal is not profit maximization, it's community benefit. And that has all sorts of knock-on impacts in terms of who's involved, how the projects are financed, who might invest in them, and other types of characteristics of the projects. Next slide. So who are we catering to with social purpose real estate? Really, each organization defines this differently. And I think this, again, in some ways, this is a bit of all of your organizations know who your audience is, and some of the audiences are citywide or even province-wide or national, and others are serving very specific cultural communities or localities. But being very clear about the definition is key. And social purpose real estate, to my mind at least, is a broad enough term that it can be everything from a performance space or a practice space, a rehearsal space on a main avenue, like a meanwhile space, all the way up to everything like the TIFF Bell Lightbox, which is a globally recognized film festival theater. Programming, again, similar story. SPRE, the term social purpose real estate at its core is about serving community, but there can be a very wide range from amateur and very local all the way up to highly professionalized. But a lot of social purpose real estate tries to work at the more community and grassroots level, and this is how we're aiming to create spaces for those activities to happen. Timelines, these projects can take a very long time. But I think it's what you'll see is the lifespan is long and it needs to be planned for over that long term. And then finally, the location. Where is your community? How have you connected with them previously? And how, what will the space that you're either in currently and trying to retain, because there's a lot of risk of displacement that we're struggling with at the moment for arts organizations. And conversely, if you're moving into a new geography, how does that happen in a way that that is responding to a need and is doing it with community? Because there have been instances where organizations have tried to shift geographies, and sometimes that creates tension with existing organizations or communities too. Okay, next slide. Types of spaces. Okay, next slide. So I've talked a lot about this. I won't, again, there's real differences between something that is completely nonprofit and community centered to more professionalized, or to more something that's more on at the intersection of for profit and not for profit. But I think at the core of this, I think we should say this. I mean, we're talking about the arts right now in a little bit of a clinical way, but I think we should be really clear. I mean, this is about joy and fun and bringing people together and building community. And so the spaces at their core have to respond to that. They have to be amenable to people convening and being, and for the space to accompany and to accommodate that. So some of those might be very quiet uses. A museum or a gallery is often more of a quiet and contemplative type of space. Some of these are meant to be loud and joyous and just raucous, like a concert venue or or nightlife spaces where activity happens. So, arts comes in all sorts of different shapes and sizes and formats and forms. And I think what we're trying to do is create a definition that's broad enough that enables people to see themselves within it. And the tools the tools and techniques of real estate and real estate development allow organizations to suit it for their own needs, both from a design perspective and a financial perspective too. Next slide. So again, you can just see the wide range of uses and the types of spaces that accommodate them. And it's so interesting how much of the heavy lifting for our arts organizations are being done in churches and church basements or religious institution basements, or in schools before and after hours, or in condo podiums, that may or may not have been initially designed for these types of art spaces, or in public libraries in their recreation rooms. I mean, the role of churches just in my community in the East End of Toronto, I can think of, my kids have gone to arts programs in, that have both practice spaces there and then do their end of term shows there. There's also cooking programs for kids, which I guess are culinary arts, which are happening in the church kitchen. And in spaces that have been retrofitted for them. So, you have these like maker spaces, you have performance spaces, rehearsal spaces. All of these are really the lifeblood of our communities. And I guess importantly too, and again, I don't need to tell this audience, they're both the social glue, they're both the social glue, but they also create economic activity, and they create jobs and whatnot too. So this really is critical that we're having these spaces and thinking through what's needed and then how they are actually provided and resourced over the long term. Next slide. So accessing these spaces. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to get a bit more development focused for the next few minutes here. There are different ways that organizations gain access to space, and the two that are most common, one is ownership, and the second one is leasing or renting. Ownership is the most expensive because the owner is responsible for, if the space is already built and you're purchasing something that's existing, you're responsible for all of the maintenance of that space, all of its property taxes, all of its expenses over the long term. Of course, the benefit is that you have much more control. You have security of tenure as long as the organization can afford to pay its mortgage, or if the mortgage is paid off, as long as it can pay its expenses, then you have much more security of tenure. You also have much more control in an ownership setting to design and redesign the building. So for organizations that require flexibility and are moving things around or trying and error, there's trial and error with different programs, the ownership can be really hugely valuable. So that can be a real benefit. I have this comment about less flexibility because what I mean by that is you're tied to that space. If an organization suddenly wants to go and try a different geography and move to a different geography, that doesn't work very well if you're tied into ownership. Also, if your organization's revenues or programming fluctuates, if you're tied into a space, that's expensive, and there's not a lot of flexibility. You can't start missing mortgage payments, but you also even if the building is paid off, which a lot of our arts organizations which gained access to space over decades may have a building that's paid off, but you still have expenses in terms of maintenance and other capital expenses, rehabilitation. So there are real advantages, and you gain access to the equity in a property market where things have tended to go up over the last 2 decades. Owners have done very well, but just because that's past trend does not equal future experience, and so we have seen a wavering in the property market for residential and certainly for commercial spaces. So it's not all upside all of the time with ownership. Even though I know ownership tends to be what many people aspire to. It's been a long-standing commentary in Canada. Like, ownership is your future profit, it's your stability, but ownership can also create its own set of challenges. And I mentioned earlier off the top, Sketch would be one example, and Artscape would be another, where having large expenditures because of taking on ownership can start to create a burden for organizations that, at their core, want to be providing art services. Leasing is another option. So leasing, many people, leasing or renting, many people will rent their spaces. We know what that means. You're paying someone else's mortgage. No one loves that, but you're also not responsible for fixing or maintenance in quite the same way. You can be short term. So if your organization is small and you're experimenting, that could be something where leasing makes sense. You may not be able to adapt or change the space all that much yourself, but you do have flexibility. And finally, there's other arrangements. Like, organizations may just come in for very short-term residencies or pop-ups, and you're seeing that more and more. And so, this is the most precarious model, but in a time of uncertainty, there may be ways that this actually benefits newer organizations or organizations trying to do something experimental or trying to see if a concept works. There may be opportunities to do meanwhile, especially as some of the commercial spaces or retail spaces have sat vacant in certain communities. There may be opportunities to partner, get a low, lower below cost or subsidized opportunity in the short term to trial a space, and that can also help arts organizations to see what works and what works for their organization and what doesn't. Next slide, please. So there are these examples. Some of them go way, way, way back. It's interesting. We're talking about we have the Transac here on this. This goes back over 50 years. That's an owned space. You have spaces that are leased, like OK Studio. You have Why Not Theater, which has varied models. Some of them meanwhile, some of them rented. So you have these different models of organizations trying to use space as a way to provide provide space for artists. And again, I just come back to that list of what artists are doing with spaces, because again, this group knows much better than I do. Arts means different things to different people at different times. A symphony still needs a practice space, and a band still needs a place to be able to practice. Or and as people are living in smaller and smaller spaces, some of those practice and meanwhile spaces are critically important, even if there are bars and restaurants and concert venues or theaters where they can provide to put on their shows once they're at a bigger scale. So there's all sorts of different spaces that are trying to be that are necessary throughout the life cycle of an arts program and an arts organization. Next slide. So let me talk. Let's get into a little bit more into the development process for those of you who are thinking, hey, maybe my organization would like to engage in development. Next slide. Okay, so at its core, I want to be like super explicit about this. It's not the funnest part of the talk, but it does need to be said. Development is risky. It has to it is something that requires a lot of pre-planning, capacity, and a level of expertise to understand how your organization and a level of self-reflection to understand where your organization is actually at, how much both skill and ability you have in this area, but also your resources, because the costs with development add up very quickly and can quickly wash over an organization that may be in relatively good financial shape for the program they're providing, but the costs of real estate and development can skyrocket in very quick ways. And there's huge expenses even at the beginning, in the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, and then ultimately into the millions if you're doing a building project. So really being kind of hard-headed about where is my organization actually at? Who will manage the project? What is the need for the project? And what will be the outcome after this project is done? So when we talk about capacity, we're talking about your experience with real estate. So some organizations have done a lot of real estate projects and have that expertise. There are arts organizations in Toronto, for example, and in other parts of our community that have done this type of work, and that puts them ahead. But as I've mentioned before, it doesn't preclude you from running into challenges, both with the risks of development, and anyone who's ever renovated anything in a home or in your office knows the cost up front is never the cost that it comes in at. And so being prepared for how you're going to handle that. And then also on the revenue side, what happens if your revenue is suddenly cut in half, or if your fundraising program doesn't go as well as might have been projected? How is that going to play out? So on the human side of this, I would encourage everyone to think through how much real estate expertise you have as an organization. Our experience has been that arts organizations are amazing at running arts programs. Some people have real estate experience, and for many others, this will be their first time through. I would encourage in that case to really think about whether you're going to bring someone on to manage the project internally, or partner and hire experts and consultants who have experience. Having someone who's advocating on your behalf, who's done this before, is really important. That is one of the key signs of success, or one of the key points that has made projects more or less successful. Even when you're hiring someone, either internally or externally, they still require management and oversight. So you don't just hire someone and then they run your project and you go to the ribbon cutting and the dirt turning at this when construction starts, and the ribbon cutting when it opens. It's an ongoing engaged process all the way through. One other point I want to flag here is, today we might be talking with executive directors and staff of arts organizations. There's also an important role for engaging with your board. The board has to be comfortable with the project because, as I've shown with a few examples, big real estate and construction and development projects, those can both make an organization hugely successful and and take you to where you want to go programmatically. But they can also derail an organization and ultimately put it in financial peril. So having your board and the types of conversations you have with your board, making sure that they have been engaged early. I would also encourage, if you're starting a development project, to have at least one person on the board who has real estate experience. And some organizations even create a real estate and development committee because they recognize that this is risky stuff, this is important, this is make it or break it for an organization. And so they're taking all of the risk management steps that they can in order to get ahead of it and make sure they have people who are giving the best of advice. Next slide. So this is a high-level schematic of what a development timeline. So I'm giving examples for if you were to go and try to redevelop a property. And again, this could be anything from, someone owns a home on a main street and they want to turn that into a small performing arts venue, all the way up to someone who's trying to do a mixed use condo like Crow's Theater with 12-story building with a 2-story theater, 1-story theater on the main floor and into the basement. So this is just to give you a general sense of the timeline. My suggestion would be to spend the first 3 months really, 1 to 3 months really trying to nail down what is the vision for this project and what is its mission. What are you trying to accomplish? On the month after the ribbon cutting and the year after the ribbon cutting, what will this venue enable you to do? What are your goals? Is it around greater audience engagement? Is it around bringing people into your space? Is it around community engagement? Is it around giving a space for equity-seeking groups? Whatever, or your own group, whatever the mission, being really clear about what you're trying to accomplish. And then my suggestion in the next 3 to 4 months would be to work very closely with an advisor or someone who has architectural and design skills to come up with a concept plan. And a concept plan is essentially a pro forma for the development. A pro forma is just the math on what are the costs and what are the revenues for the project itself. So that's and then you would have some renderings that show what it could visually look like. And so this early stage is so important, and it's very iterative. So you don't often come up with it on the first go around. It's often a lot of back and forth of, if we do it this way, it'll cost a certain amount, and then maybe we can refine the vision or scale it up or down. Notice too that we've separated out the concept plan from the business plan. So the concept plan is the plan for the development. The business plan is the plan for the organization. How are you actually going to pay for this? And I'm being so explicit about this. I really want to dwell on it to make sure that it's clear. Like, having a project where the economics of the project work may not be sufficient for the business of the organization. And I'm using the word business, even though we're talking to nonprofits, because as you all know, more so than I do, you still need to make payroll, and you still need to have your revenues exceeding your costs every year. So in that sense, what we're trying to do is make sure that we have a plan that enables the organization to thrive as it's going through this development project. Now, you may be wondering, how much does all of this cost? This ideation and feasibility stage, because you're going to be bringing on different advisors. You're going to be bringing on maybe even someone in-house. This can be expensive. Our experience is that the first stage, the mission and visioning, that's in the 50,000 to 100,000. Once you're getting into the real concept and business stage, you're getting into some bigger real numbers. So that can start to be a more expensive undertaking. Then you get into delivery, and you can see the pre-development and construction phase, which typically takes between 6 months and 2 years. This is where you're hiring a lot of consultants. If you were to go and look at the list of all the studies and all the reports you need to do a development, it's like the length of your arm. It's everything from the engineering and architecture of the building to the zoning of the site and property, all the way through to you might, depending on what community you're in, you might need a shadow study, a traffic study, a water site study, how the water is going to flow off the site, a parking study. There are any number of studies. All of these cost money and have expenses associated with them. Then you're going to move into construction, and there are also development charges that come along with any big building project. So that will have to be factored in too. Then you get into construction. Construction can take depending on the size of your project. I mean, it can be a year and a half. If you're building, again, like a small local theater on a main street, or rehabilitating a home, all the way up to if you're building a giant theater, it could take years. And then finally, you have the operation and maintenance. And I wanted to flag this too, because the story doesn't stop once you reach the ribbon cutting. Then you have this building that, if you may be the owner of your organization, and now you have to operate and maintain it, and that has costs. That has real costs too. And we know that many of our arts facilities are getting aging, and just like any other parts of our infrastructure that is breaking down, some of our arts spaces are breaking down as well. So you have to make sure that you have the resources put aside and the processes to make sure that it can be maintained over the long term. Next slide. Okay, so I've covered much of this. I won't recap this. Next slide, please. Yeah, this just highlights who you're going to work with and when you should bring them on. So the early stages, the mission and vision, you can do much of that yourself. But really, once you're getting into the pre-development and pre-construction, that's when you're going to start working with consultants. So the planner, the architect will bring in a designer and probably an engineer for the building. You're going to apply for permits. Do be prepared that even if your organization is beloved and your services are really favorable in the community, not everyone is going to necessarily think this is a great idea and want it as their neighbor. And there is a lot of NIMBYism out there, and you'd be surprised. Things that look like they should have been smooth sailing and everyone would want in their backyard often bring up all sorts of challenges. So for example, we've had examples where communities have pushed back against daycares, for example. That's hard to believe, but people push back against daycares because they're worried about parking in front of the building and noise from the children. People have pushed back against theaters for some of the same reason. People have pushed back against night venues. Certainly for music venues, there's been a lot of conflict with neighbors around late night, nightclubs and other types of night venues where arts activities might be taking place. So again, even if your vision and your experience in your community is very positive, when this becomes a development project, development projects will always face certain types of pushback, and you should be ready for those and prepared to have answers for how you're going to manage if it's noise at night, or if it's parking, or if it's access and how people are going to get there, or if it's shadows because you're building on a main street that was at currently 1 or 2 stories and you're going to be putting up something that's 6 stories. How are you going to manage that? These questions can be overcome, and they should be, because the arts and culture sector is really important to our communities. But we do need to recognize that there is an engagement process that's required as these projects go forward, to make sure that your neighbors are supportive and your community is supportive too. And then you have to supervise the construction process. And I guess what I'm getting at through all of this is, if you are moving into this and you're taking the lead on a development project, you don't just hire consultants and advisors and then let them go and they turn over the keys when it's done. It really is a much more engaged process, and certainly your executive director and your board, this will become something that takes up a lot of your time and a lot of your mental bandwidth and space. So just consider that as you're going through, if this is really something you want to take on. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just to reiterate the importance of maintenance, that, property management, you can hire someone to do that if you own the building, but it is important that is thought about in advance, and what the revenue is going to be to pay for that. So it might be through programming. You might sublease the building to someone else so that you're generating revenue as well. That's a possibility. But you do need to think about maintenance at the outset, not once the building opens. Next slide. Okay, ownership and governance. I'm going to talk just for a couple more minutes. I'm going to wrap up so we can have discussion. Ownership and governance. Next slide. Okay, so this really is about who operates and owns the space, who's responsible for what, and what risk do they take if things go right and if things go wrong. And what I'm encouraging at the bottom here is to think about partnerships, that you don't have to do all of this yourself, that there may be ways to collaborate with a for-profit developer or another nonprofit developer to think about what may be possible. Next slide. So, you know, there are any number of different ways that this can go. You can have public ownership, who then subleases to nonprofit tenants. You can have a cooperative that takes this on, um, takes this role on as sort of like the head lease, it's often called, or the owner, and then subleases to others. Next slide. You can have a condominium model where I know we often think of condominium as a private space, but actually it can be different spaces within the building can be owned by different operators. I think this one works quite well actually because the spaces are separated. So everyone knows what responsibility they have for each space, each unit owner, and then they each have shared governance of the building overall. And this condominium model can be used by nonprofits. So it doesn't, again, I'm using the word condominium, which kind of evokes private for-profit development, but it can be, it's just a development structure that could be used. Increasingly, we're hearing people talk about, there's the nonprofit model where the one nonprofit owns the space, does the property management, and then leases to others. This is what Artscape was doing, and they ran into trouble because they were struggling with leases and having enough people using their spaces and paying. Finally, the land trust. This is getting a lot of attention and a lot of interest, and this is more community owned and community ownership space, which I think is really an exciting way of thinking about ownership. But keep in mind, even with a land trust, someone is going to be in control of the overarching building and then is going to be providing either leases or shared spaces. But even with a land trust, the revenue doesn't, the pressure on revenue doesn't disappear. There may not be a profit motive in there, but you still have to have the revenue to pay off whatever mortgage got taken on and to pay for the operation and maintenance. Next slide. A lot of organizations are leasing in private spaces, and we shouldn't, even if it's social purpose, you still might fit in a private space. So I wouldn't discount that overall, especially, as real estate spaces are becoming, as commercial real estate has struggled, there might be opportunities for organizations to gain access to sites, maybe that even just 4 or 5 years ago you could never envision. And in this case, you become a tenant, which has its pros and cons, like we've talked about as well. Next slide, please. Okay, maybe I'll just start to wrap up here by saying I would really encourage organizations to think collaboratively. We talk a lot in our organization about the collaborative advantage. So how do you achieve outcomes that are better than any one organization could achieve on their own? And the way that this works best is when you have people with different skills and capacities where those skills fit together. So an organization like an arts organization may not have construction management skill, but you will be great at running a theater and running an arts organization. And so, that can generate value for another partner who may want someone on their main floor who's generating animation and activation on their main floor, but isn't necessarily, realizes that the retail landscape has changed, for example, and they might not be able to find someone to lease that space. So an arts organization, especially one that has access to donors or one that is getting government support, that could be a really long-term, excellent partner in a building project. Next slide. Okay, just very quickly to wrap up. Next slide. I've talked a fair amount about this. I don't want to scare people off, but I do want to give just the reality of this, just so people are really going into any development project with their eyes open. High costs of developing and acquiring land, that's clear. Arts organizations, there aren't a huge number of policies and supports at the moment. Everyone is laser focused on housing, housing, housing. I think that's critical, but we need to make sure we're creating spaces for community to thrive. In many ways, the arts, there haven't been the same type of incentive programs built in for arts organizations. And then finally, the last one I think is the most critical, is making sure that you have a sustainable operating business model. And again, I don't love that term business model, but we're saying whatever term we use, you need to make sure that you have the money coming in to pay for the expenses, or else you can put your whole organization in jeopardy. Next slide. I've talked a bit about this. Next slide. Yeah, this is where I want to end. I want to end just saying, we've done some research at the Infrastructure Institute, thinking about what spaces can be successful and how they thrive. And all I would say is on this point is I think there's an opportunity to start mixing uses and mixing spaces in a lot more creative ways that take some of the create synergies between programming and also take some of the financial pressure off of organizations. So what I would encourage, a lot of if you think about what our arts spaces look like today, many of them are 1 and 2 story buildings, and those 1 and 2 story buildings may vary by size depending on whether it's a neighborhood building or in a small community, or whether it's something as big as the Four Seasons Center for the Performing Arts in downtown Toronto. And in each of these cases, what you find is that they're often relatively low-rise buildings without much above them. And I would argue that we're leaving so much social value on the table and so much financial value. Above many of those spaces, we could be creating spaces for artists to live or other people in our community who are struggling and need affordable places to live. So I would encourage you to think about how your types of development projects could mix in, be adaptively and creatively mixed uses so that your programming is being delivered. Absolutely, that should be number one, but also that you're using the value that's in that airspace or as part of your development in order to reinvest in yourself and in your organization and in your community. Last slide, please. So there are others who are doing this, who are out there. I think it's great that ArtsBuild Ontario is taking the lead on this. There's Akin, there's OCAD, who has a cultural policy hub. There's the Space Coalition. We at the Infrastructure Institute run our social purpose real estate program. We'd be thrilled to get inquiries and provide support. So there's a lot of support out there. This is both a challenging time, but also an exciting time. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we'll have now. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks so much, Maddie. We really appreciate all the information and taking us through the slide deck. We're going to open things up for questions right now, and we can pose these to Maddie or me or Alex. We're all here to provide you with commentary and thoughts. So Andrea Battersby just leads us off with the key question that everybody is asking.
Mm-hmm.
Can you point to an arts organization in Toronto that does have a sustainable model? Okay, well, Maddie can jump in on this too, but sustainable, of course, is a mark point in time, kind of like a balance sheet. It's a moment in time, and in a moment in time tells you a thing about a thing. So at this moment, I would say that, Crow's Theatre is a sustainable model that has a variety of inputs into it from multiple sources. And I think any time that you're differentiating all of your economic inputs so that you're not just relying on grants or tickets, but if you also have some rents and some short-term space leases and possibly even some long-term leases, then you're creating opportunities to stabilize your funding base over time so that if any one of those things goes sideways, then you have a backup. Then there are organizations too that have sustainable models that don't involve space. So I looked at Tafel Music Baroque Orchestra, who I know quite a bit about from their relationship with Trinity St. Paul's. And, ArtsBuild did a case study on them. And their sustainability is strongly built on the fact that they are in partnership with Trinity St. Paul's and that they have actively chosen not to have control of that venue so that they can focus on their artistic excellence as a very powerful, very engaged, very partnership-based renter in that space. So those are some of the things I think about off the top. Maddie, Alex, just some others you want to pop in there?
Alex, why don't you go ahead?
I mean, I'm thinking of a lot of the hubs that we're seeing in the city of Toronto in particular. So if I think of those and I think of other communities outside of that of the city of Toronto, which is its own environment and ecology in its own right. But a couple that pop up for me, of course, are I always look at the King Collective. They are so flexible in terms of the spaces that they occupy. It's not it's modular. It's and it moves with the opportunities as we see uh these vacant buildings here, right? As development progresses and evolves in our communities. So I'm really always fascinated with all of their studios that are coming up. Um and how they're temporary spaces too. So that's an example I look at. So while it's not fixed in one location, the model itself has a sustainability about it, that it has how that organization has moved on over the years and grown is really fascinating to me. And of course, just look at our stalwart at 401 Richmond, that
Mhm.
development getting in where it was at the time, and how that's really just become an anchor facility for so many arts organizations who have started there, moved on from there, continue to be drawn there. So those are two that really stand out for me when I think about sustainable social purpose real estate for arts.
Yeah, and before we just
Maddie,
pop
what are your
back over to Maddie, I just wanted to point out to Alex, as you were saying that, I was also thinking, we all know this, but there is a privilege of having entered the funding stream at a certain point, and a privilege that came from being an organization that came up in the 70s and 80s and 90s is not the same thing as an organization that came post 2000. So let's just acknowledge the differential both in the cost of infrastructure, but also in entering the funding stream at a time when there was less in the funding stream and more flexibility within that. So, Maddie, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, just quickly, Kendra, that isn't that the same story as like in our housing market where
Mhm.
our millennial and Gen Zs are saying the exact same thing that like, those of you who entered the property market in the 2000s, like it's just not the same market. And I think that's the same in the arts organization. It's just the parallels between the housing market and the sort of commercial and arts and cultural spaces are similar. I think one of the things that jumps out to me, is this. I was struck actually by the example of TIFF and Luminato becoming roommates. That like people are. I don't know if that speaks to their financial success or their financial desperation, but I do think it shows that organizations are trying to get creative with how they use space, and in moments where there's, you know, in moments where there's rising costs. I mean, people are trying to come up with creative ways, and I think out of those creative ways, I mean, one way to look at that is, this is really a sign of trouble that they're having to move out of their space and shack up together and become roommates. Another way is that maybe they're using those spaces more efficiently and people are thinking about space differently post pandemic. And so I think it's just, I don't know what it says exactly. Folks on this call will have much more insight on this than I do, but I do think it's interesting that like coming out of the pandemic and with work from home and all sorts of other types of approaches, we may think about art spaces in slightly different ways. And Alex, your comment about 401 Richmond is just like so spot on. Like that's a space that was just flexible and creative and enables people to come and go and it shift and be adaptive. And I do think like we're going to have to think about these spaces and the way organizations work in a bit of a different, in a less linear way than maybe we did even 10, 15 years ago.
Great question
Yeah,
here
I want to
from, oh, go ahead, Alex.
No, I just want to jump in on from Maddie's point. I'm sorry to do that too soon on this call, but I think a lot of our organizations that we're seeing at ArtsBuild Ontario, we're no longer building, the majority are not building like they used to 10 years ago. So the funding landscape has certainly changed. So funders are aware of this as well. And so we're really looking at those shared space partnerships and these innovative models that were discussed today. So that is the trend that is moving forward. But it's really interesting to look at the facilities that are still there today, and we just thinking about like what's going to be there generations from now. So really, just prioritizing cultural infrastructure as new development is made
Mhm.
is pretty crucial, I think. Yeah. So that's where I think a lot of the sector or our networks at right now is those shared space partnerships. So TIFF and Luminato, definitely looking at them.
Mhm.
Okay, sorry, Kendra.
No, not at all. No, it's great, Alex. A couple great questions here. The absolutely wonderful Victoria Steele. Nice to see you, Victoria. Uh, so, if not already asked, where is the funding today for organizations to be able to manage the expertise for the pre-development work? My clients have struggled to secure this, and then my consulting team has few resources to do the robust analysis that Maddie describes. Uh, Maddie, I'll let you jump in on that, and I also have some thoughts that may support this.
Why don't you go first, Kendra? I'll go after.
Okay, cool. Awesome. So a couple things. First of all, the landscape, as you've, I'm sure, gathered, Victoria, is changing dramatically, and it's changing dramatically in relation to social impact funding. And so where I'm seeing the most movement around funding pre-development work is in social impact funding. So for instance, with Re11 used to be Trinity Centers Foundation, who I work with on church and historic space repurposing. We will have a social impact fund that will launch the first week in January. That'll be a $30 million fund that people can access for pre-development work on historic and church sites. We're not the only ones, right? So we have Tapestry right now working with the community bonds approach, and they're working in networks of neighborhoods in order to do a community bond approach to pre-development work. United Way of Greater Toronto is also putting together a social impact fund, which I'm not sure if it's launched yet, but is if it has not, it is launching soon. That came along with that study they just did that was heat mapping Toronto and about the gaps in available spaces for community to be. And so they are looking to fund some of that as well. And then there are individual foundations. So community foundations, I'm finding now, if you hit the right community foundation and the right family within that, you can access pre-development funds. And then the last thing I would say is that this is how, and Maddie can speak more to this too, and we're going to get into this with Rodney Wiltz in the session 2 from now. This is how you build a relationship with a developer. So if in fact you are building something that is bigger than just a singular arts organization, which in large cities now you probably are, you're probably also building housing because density is key to solving all the problems of our communities right now. You can access those pre-development funds in joint venture and collaborative relationships with developers. I won't get into that today. You're going to have to join us for Rodney Wiltz to dig in on that. But Maddie, do you have more thoughts on any of that?
No, I think that's how I would answer that too. And I would just remind people too, a lot of the programs that are out there now for pre-development funds are loans,
Yeah,
not grants. So be
exactly.
aware you will have to pay that money back, whether your project goes forward or not. If your project goes forward, the way that it often works is the money is paid back through your construction financing, and then ultimately goes onto your mortgage and you pay it off through whatever your long-term revenue is. If the project doesn't go through, I'm worried about this actually for a lot of organizations that we're increasingly hearing about pre-development funds, and the fine print is that it's a loan that's repayable and some depending on
Yep.
how many years after the project starts. That creates risk if your studies show maybe you shouldn't go forward with this, or your organization changes over time. So people should just be really aware and of what they're actually signing up for when they get into these pre-development programs. They're critically important because it has been super hard to raise that money. But just be aware if it's a loan, that's different than if someone's giving you money to, for more explorative work.
Such a good point, Maddie. And I think we're not as aware as we should be of the risks that we're undertaking. And it's always good to take some sober second thought. And, don't be afraid to not know what you don't know. Bring
Mm-hmm.
together communities of people, ask them, I have such a memory of when I was at Cahoots Theater Projects and thinking about a new space, having a feeling it was the wrong plan and going over and talking to the now deceased Ginny Stulk and her saying, no, your instinct is right. This is a bad plan, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's good to have to rely on each other for those kinds of strengths of assessment, right? Andrea's asking, are we aware of any successful organizations with affordable housing, artists, and creative spaces? We're gonna do a case study on 221A, Brian McBay, who Maddie and I spent a silly amount of time with this past week at the Canadian Urban Institute out of Vancouver. And Brian is doing some fundamentally fantastic work, which also links a bit to some of the other questions we have here around land trusts. And Maddie and I, if you came in early, we're chatting about land banks, all of which is
Mm-hmm.
to say there's a lot of things in motion. And then, of course, we have our second case study, which is Tapestry Nightwood, which will also
Mm-hmm.
bring forth a whole bunch about organizations with affordable housing and artists and creative spaces. I think from my perspective as a person who's run a lot of those organizations who have lots of things happening at once, not affordable housing yet. We're in the midst of building some of those. The thing to remember is that it's messy and that messy is great, that we learn from having lots of people in play with us together, and that it's hard to have a perfect quiet theater space that also has affordable housing and a community hub. And so we need to flex a little bit with the needs of other communities. Uh, Alex, Maddie, any I missed on those?
Just to say, Kendra, to pick up on your last point there, I did a bunch of interviews for a project I was doing on social purpose real estate and creative mixed use. And one person told me, and this will come as no surprise, the key with these when the deals are so complex, like you're putting together different partners and different parties, like it's quite rare at this point in most geographies that you're going to be able to just build a freestanding facility on its own. And I would argue that actually in most cases, we should be trying to integrate housing in one way or another, whether it's artist housing or affordable housing or even market housing in spaces where it'll work. The key is to come up with a common language and to fail fast. Like you'll know very quickly, Kendra, you said it, like you'll know if the deal doesn't feel right. You'll know if the person standing across from you is just gonna like drive you crazy from the first moment till the end of this, and it's just not a match. And I talk a lot about collaborative advantage, which I do think is, it's this idea that there are projects and benefits that can be achieved by working together that are better than you could do on your own. There's also this idea of collaborative inertia where everyone wants to be at the table because the deal and the partnership becomes more important than the outcome. And, sometimes these things drag on for years and just really tax everyone's patience. And I would encourage you to come up with processes that allow you to decide, like, is this something that's going to fly? Is this something I want to be involved in? You'll tell pretty quickly. And then either you go deeper on it and invest more resources, or you say, you know what, this just isn't for us. We're gonna move on.
Amazing. Popping over to the chat, Brampton Arts Organizations to everyone. Geez, Brampton Arts Organizations, just bringing a small question. The City of Toronto's new cultural action plan has ambitious goals for the development of new creative space, 1 million square feet. What are some straightforward changes or projects you think could be implemented quickly to address the space crisis in a timely manner? Okay, I've been saying this one for 15 years, and so has lots of people at the City of Toronto. They need to bring back the mortgage guarantees and the loan guarantees. So there was a time that the City of Toronto would be a co-signer to a loan or a mortgage with you, or they would be the first loss point. We need to bring back the City of Toronto being the point of first loss. We also need to bring back the Cultural Capital Spaces Fund that was the City of Toronto based one. Forget what it was called. It existed for such a short period of time, and it was the wrong period of time. We weren't ready. And so they were like anticipating us. And so it died because of lack of people applying. And that was, I sat on that jury and it was true. Not a lot of people were applying because we weren't ready. Those are the two I would say. Maddie, Alex, what do you got about making things happen quickly?
You go,
Nope.
Alex.
Well, I always look at our I would say an organization has to look inwards first at their assets. So they look at what they can build on. And as I mentioned before, 10 years ago, I think the growth trajectory is at a different rate right now. So I would say incremental growth, sustainable growth is always key when like looking out for an organization who is in need of more space. There's so much adaptive reuse opportunity, and I also think there's a lot of potential for relationship building with those building owners and the property owners. So whether that's a municipality or that's private, I think there's a lot of ground to uncover there. But I think it takes a lot of work and a lot of exploration. So there's no straight forward path from point A to point B in these things. So every organization has its own unique needs, and every developer or property owner is going to have their priorities too. So Maddie, when you mentioned like you want to make sure that the relationship is really in sync from the get-go, that's really important to make sure those values are aligned between organizations. So I would just say like go on an exploring mission. It's like always sounds exciting to me just to see what's already out there. And I think funders as well are looking at supporting those adaptive reuse renovation projects right now for the arts and culture in particular. So funders like the Canada Cultural Spaces Fund and OTF are places to go for those things. Those are my thoughts right now. Maddie, what about you?
Name is yours. And I would just echo and amplify the idea if these are for municipalities, like they should be scouring every square inch of their real estate holdings. First and foremost, to see what they can build housing on or repurpose as housing. And second of all, what buildings could they immediately adaptively reuse so arts organizations and others can get in there and start using them. And the pandemic really changed how people use space in our cities. Retail, for example, is struggling. Commercial and office is struggling. Brampton is in many ways unique. It's growing very quickly. It has a big warehousing sector. So Brampton, some of this may apply or may not apply, but the city of Brampton likely holds huge amounts of real estate, some of which could be used as meanwhile spaces. Even if it's not going to be the most permanent thing, it could be something that's used in the short term. And again, even if it's not performance space, it might be practice space or rehearsal space or fabrication space. There's different ways that that these spaces can be used on different terms, and creating opportunities for people to be a bit more experimental. I mean, that's the other part of this. Like, there's kind of a spectrum of organizations, some of whom are super established, or know exactly what the outcome of every initial practice is going to be, and others who are really just trying trial and error. And I think our municipalities in particular could be trying to amplify that by looking at their own portfolios and creating mechanisms to allow people to get in there and just start using those spaces a bit more intensively.
Awesome. Back over to the Q&A. Victoria has asked what incentives exist so that we don't lose spaces like Factory. And she's also pointed out about the PAL model, so Performing Arts Lodge model. And yes, I remember that, Victoria. You guys are doing amazing work in Ottawa, creating a new site there for senior artists to live and also have creative space that will be shared. So yeah, that's awesome. I don't know what to say about how we don't lose spaces like Factory, other than back to if everybody could just spend some time getting educated about land banks and land trusts and those kinds of things, then maybe collectively we can come up with some answers. I have some thoughts about it, but they're all early thoughts, and I think that's important. We are inventive people. We experiment with things. What Maddie said about, fail early is important.
Mm-hmm.
Experiment with things without money, experiment with ideas and see where it takes you. Maddie, any other thoughts on how we don't lose spaces? I mean, it's a challenge.
Yeah. Maybe something that could be open for debate with this group. I think there's some sites and some venues that are going to be entirely nonprofit or government led. There are others that are just by nature of the site lend themselves to being done in partnership with the private sector. My line on this has always been there's a spectrum and a range of private sector that means different things in different contexts. There are some who are just like rapacious developers who are just trying to get in and out and make as much money as humanly possible as quickly as possible. It's going to always be hard to partner with those folks. But there are others who have a track record of at least trying to find creative solutions, whether it's for affordable housing or for shelters or for arts organizations. And if you can find one of those folks, they're not going to be altruistic. They're still doing this for profit. Be aware of that. You're not, this isn't like you're getting you're partnering with a charity, but you can find ways that it's win-win and that they will come to the table and engage and enable spaces to be built or buildings to be saved. And we have seen some of that over the years. So I would, if there is a building that's at risk of being, of being lost, I would just try to see actually who that developer is and what their track record is and how they've actually gone through the world and what their statements are. And you may find that there might be an opening, especially if it can be brokered by a municipality or a large, foundation or whatnot. There may be opportunities that actually some of these spaces can be saved. Because just, I guess, one point on the private developers, they're looking for things to put on the main floor of their buildings. Like it is not, their dream and fantasy may be just to have some, a Starbucks and a Shoppers Drug Mart, but that's not going to be in every building. And so they're looking for stable long-term tenants who have a long-term revenue stream and also may give their building a bit of something may differentiate it from others. And so I would just encourage people to at least scope out who that counterparty is. If it's bad luck and it's just someone who wants to just get in and get out as quickly as possible, that's not going to work. But there may be others who do have track record and would be willing under the right circumstances to collaborate and partner.
All right, I'm going to have to stop questions here, but I'll have a look through after if Eva can just save that for us and see if there's anything else that we can answer quickly. I just want to sum up here, wrap us up. I want to thank Maddie and Alex for putting together this amazing session today, and all of you for joining us with your awesome questions. And I look forward to continuing conversations with you all in person or online. I hope you're all leaving with something new and you've piqued curiosity on some of these approaches, and that you'll join us as we dig more into the pieces of this that Maddie so generously introduced us to. So we're going to be publishing the first case study, and that, as I mentioned, is going to be Tapestry and Nightwood. So that's going to be coming out soon about their space at 877 Yonge Street. So that'll be coming out on social media and on the website. So we look forward to sharing that. We are, yes, going to be doing one with 221A. So people who are saying they've been trying to reach out to 221A, leave poor Brian alone. He's trying to talk to everybody. We'll try to summarize it all for you and bring it back so that we can all learn from the awesomeness that's happening there as well. There are some SPRE resources on ArtsBuild website as well as the Infrastructure Institute, and there's some great opportunities there. And the Infrastructure Institute has some micro videos on their YouTube channel that I know on occasion when I found myself not sure about things, I've deked into to check stuff out. There'll be three more modules in the winter and spring of 2025, so stay tuned. And the next one is going to be, we think it'll be either Indigenous land and ownership models, or it'll be owning, renting, and community land trusts. We're just working out who has time because we want the best people for you. Lastly, this program is for you. Eva's going to pop up a thing that gives you a survey. We want to hear about the content and what you would like to know about. So case studies and panels that meet your learning needs and reflect your current arts funding and real estate landscape. Take 2 or 3 minutes to complete the survey if you've got time. It should be emailed out to you too, I think. Your input will be shared by the community and reflected in the program content. So the survey link is going into the chat and will be in the follow-up email, along with the recording and the presentation materials, which will be in French as well. If surveys aren't your thing, don't worry, just drop a line to the ArtsBuild program manager, which is programs@artsbuildontario.ca, and they will connect with you. So follow it all on social media and Eventbrite, and subscribe to the newsletter. And we're so happy to have had you here. Alex, Maddie, do you want to say a quick goodbye?
Hi, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. And we look forward to seeing you in person and at the theater and at dance and at music events near you soon. And have a great holiday in whatever way you celebrate.